Okay, this is it. This is Donovan, and this is the grand finale of Sex and Sacrament. I finally got the last section of the last chapter done. This is something I put off writing, not put off writing, yeah, kind of, for 8 years. And what took me so long to get it done is I ended up folding into it the autobiography that was asked of me after I spoke at the Progressive Youth Ministry Conference in 2014, the very first one right after I first came out. I was a speaker there, and I was asked to write an autobiography that now I know why, having reviewed what the manuscript looked like the last couple weeks. I know why they didn't pick it up, even though they commissioned it. So what's valuable and salvageable from that is in this last section, as well as drawing together all these different threads from all the different chapters that we've been leading up to now about prayer and sacramental theology and interfaith practice. And then the other thing that's in here is this is also very much influenced by my experience studying for and teaching gender and popular culture in the University of California system on their Irvine campus in 2014. So as well as everything, there's a lot here. There's more footnotes in this section than any other chapter of the book. This is the longest chapter of the book, and I do realize that much like a symphony, it's picking up the themes and motifs that have been recurring throughout the whole book and just bringing everything together. So it's long, it's dense. I couldn't even fit all the footnotes in the description of this video. And here goes. All right, so one of the things I thought I'd do too is maybe because I'm sharing this on YouTube, I can do something that I won't be able to do in the audiobook or in the text, and that is to share with you the visual components of what I was talking about the other day. So before I actually start reading, I'm going to just share with you. This is my God box. It's a little teeny tiny box. Prayer box is what it says on it. And in here, in one of the last episodes, I was telling you that I used to pray these Hebrew prayers of blessing with the LGBTQ students from the Evangelical University that I used to work at. I know this is backwards, but you can just see that I have my little cheat sheet of how to pronounce the Hebrew, and I have an English translation as best I could. That one was praising God, seeing a beautiful person. I've talked about that prayer several times in this book. And then I could just show you, you're just going to have to take my word for it so I don't bore you with all these little index cards, but there's a whole box of little index cards in here and mementos, and I would draw from this box these little index cards of notes as we would pray together before meals. So I just wanted you to know that was a real thing and not, I mean, if you weren't there, how would you know? And then I'm gonna carry this little camera with me, I think, for a minute. I'm gonna show you that I used to have a home before I lost my position, and a room that was a home office, and it was my whole library. And the books of my library were on 4 walls, floor to ceiling. On all 4 walls, and then I had a university office. Sorry, I'll be here too. I had a university office too. That was the same way. That whole university office, which I had to myself, I was very spoiled. I know now. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, all 4 walls was books. And here's what's left. Most of those I gave away to students and colleagues, mostly students. When I lost my position, and over the years, my life got simpler and simpler, and I had less room to store books. So now I rent a room from friends, and I have this little, in this closet, which is, this is what I got left. So the reason I'm showing you this is I wanted you to see confessions. The autobiography that got folded into this mostly came from, or my suggestion was that I was going to write a version of Confessions, or a rewrite of, my own kind of spiritual autobiography that was modeled after Augustine's Confessions. I'm trying to show you how marked up this text is. I don't know if you can really tell how weather beaten and dog-eared, and how much I've read this over the years. I first started reading it for and with students, and I've been sharing with you all along that I read it during that year I was bedridden and sick and dying from the hormones and the psych meds and all that. And I was praying it, and I was trying to prepare things to share with students, but ended up kind of becoming the springboard for these meditations that became this book. Anyway, another thing I'm trying to show you, one of the only books I have left is my Bible. And this is the Bible I used to teach out of that is now held together with a screen repair kit. And also, has scribbles from both of my children when they were toddlers. But again, there's a lot of the Bible in here, particularly in this last section. And again, I just wanted to show you that what I have left is what I love and read most. And it's it's well worn. I mean, I haven't just read these things once and then just pontificated on them. These are very, very well loved books. If you're a book lover, you know what I'm talking about. But I've lived and prayed these things. I haven't just studied them one time and then launched into my own thoughts. I don't know if that makes a difference to anybody else, but sometimes, I don't know, I just had the impression after, here's the last episode, and I was like, I've been very wordy and I've been very much of a talking head, and that's not how I actually live. I'm talking about embodied prayer and everything being sacrament. So I don't know, I just thought it may be meaningful to show you that, these little objects or focus objects and writings and notes and things, mostly things that I've shared with people, things that are meaningful to me because I've shared them with people who are meaningful to me. I don't have much, but a few of those things are still in my life, and they're very much affecting this last section. This last section is called Our Love Embellishes the World, Sex as Sacrament. As I begin this final meditation on the goodness of all creation, including queer bodies and queer partnerships, I first confess the limits of my own direct knowledge and experience of human love. Even so, here with thanksgiving, I praise the Creator for all the love to which I bear witness in this world. In other words, other people's love, and for the fruits that shameless love, open love, out of the closet love, brings forth in this world that make this world more beautiful, making visible that infinite light of grace so often obscured by fear-driven divisiveness and violence, especially by religious people. In other words, when religious people are fighting and violent and excluding, that does not shine the light of the love that draws us to God. On the other hand, the light that I've seen in queer couples and queer families and queer communities, that has been unconditional. That has pointed me and many other people in the direction of not only community and connection and grace and love, but even toward faith. To some, our love and our existence, when I say our, I mean sex orientation and gender minorities, our love and our existence for some doesn't speak that same message of unconditional love. Why is it that the existence of different kinds of bodies and partnerships evokes only revulsion, confusion, or shame for some people, while others of us are inspired to praise, thanksgiving, and awe, a deeper sense of the mysteries and unrestrained loving creativity of God? Ancient African teacher Augustine suggested the beauty appears in the same way to both beholders, but to one it is speechless, and to the other it speaks. Or rather, it speaks to all, but only they understand who test the voice heard outwardly against the truth within. Speaking of things that point you to God, right? The voices of children and playful dogs. I'm going to close the window. Okay. Not that I don't want to hear those wonderful things, but it's a little distracting for this particular task. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that I thought it was useful what Augustine had to say about this is that we can be looking at the same thing and one person can get nothing out of it that inspires them and another person can be inspired to praise. The beauty appears in the same way to both beholders, but to one it is speechless, to the other it speaks, or rather it speaks to all, but only they understand who test the voice heard outwardly. And here he's talking about general revelation. Anything we see outwardly in the world is beautiful. They test it against the truth that's within them. And that inner truth is the unconditional love and creativity in whose image we are made. So for some of us, that queer bodies and queer love points us in the direction of the source of all love, whatever that might be for you, the higher truth, that which is greater than human division and human fear and human violence. For some people who aren't looking for that, it doesn't point them in that direction. That's Augustine's explanation. I thought it was worth considering. And here I join him in one of his prayers that's in that same section of the book. To all things which stood around the portals of my flesh, I said, tell me of my God. You are not he, but tell me something of him. Then they lifted up their mighty voices and cried, he made us. My questioning was my attentive spirit, and their reply, their beauty. So this last chapter, and especially this last section, is the message my year of bedridden prayer years ago in my study at that time would not allow me to avoid. And somehow this message that our love embellishes the world, our queer love embellishes the world, somehow, even though I couldn't live it out while I was on my sick bed and fading away, it somehow stayed with me, emboldened me by the following year to trust God enough to be honest about how God made me. And yet, I've been living in the truth of those prayers of Augustine that I just shared with you, and the truth of this deep message that I kept trying to push away, that I couldn't get away from, that queer love embellishes the world. It is sacramental, it is sacred, it is God created and good, and points us in the direction of good. I could never find words to write all this down. So this section I've been dragging my feet for 8 years to finish this book and write this conclusion. And I'm still struggling to find words, especially since I can't speak from experience on this. I guess I really thought that when I was getting this message, or especially after I came out, I guess I assumed that I was headed in the direction of a sacramental queer marriage myself. And I was in a marriage, and I initially thought this understanding was meant to help me. It did equip me at the time, actually, to live faithfully in my marriage, which I always did. But anyway, I thought there was something more to this for me other than to be the messenger. But it turns out I'm a messenger, and in humility, I'm admitting I don't have direct contact the last 8 years, since even before my marriage broke up. We were in separate rooms, separate floors of our house, actually. So I'm not a person that can speak to this with a whole lot of lived experience of it. But why am I sharing? I just really feel a need to be humble about that and to be honest about that, since other people do have lived experience with this. And I just want to say that what I'm speaking from, or what I'm confessing, and this section is a confessional prayer, is that I learned from my failure to live into marriage in a sacramental way. I was faithful, but I didn't treat it as sacramental in the ways I'm about to describe to you, that it seems to me are the gift that we can have. I learned from my failure to live into marriage in a sacramental way that heterosexuality all by itself is not enough to imbue a marriage or a sex act with God's grace. Being in a cisgendered body, doing all kinds of interventions to an intersex body like mine to make it endosex or normal or typical, to force it into a binary gender assignment that it was given at birth, that doesn't make a marriage sacred. Not by itself. I mean, for some people, maybe they can do that and experience marriage as sacramental, and I'm sure they can. But those things alone, the way our bodies are shaped, whether or not they are binary in their outer or inner expression, whether or not our partner is an opposite sex partner, a same sex partner, or one or both of us are non-binary in some kind of way, those are not the things that make marriage sacred or point us to God's grace. And the same with celibacy. Celibacy alone, again, there I can speak with lived experience. Celibacy all by itself doesn't immediately become sacramental. It's the way we live this out. What makes a marriage, sexual intimacy, or a life of singleness sacred instead of lonesome, because you can certainly be lonesome inside a marriage, is whether we experience it as a gift, whether we dedicate it, hearts wide open, unshackled by shame or false dependence on another person as if they're a power greater than ourselves. How do I experience? What is the quality of my experience? What am I bringing to it? What is my intention in it? Whether I'm single or married, whatever the gender of myself or my partner may be. No matter our gender or sex, no matter the gender or sex of our partner, if we have one, love can flow through us and nourish everything we are and do when we let it. Loving creatively, completely, and meaningfully is an issue of meaning, intention, and purpose, not a gender issue. Augustine's own prayerful meditation on the goodness of all creation in Confessions pointed me here in the first place, and exploring it again these past few days, as I showed you when we started in that dog-eared book. All the orange markings were new markings from the past week. Augustine distinguishes between two kinds of love in this book, building on the foundation that I have been sharing about repeatedly throughout this series and in this book, that Augustine also talks about throughout his book, that the condition of creation, including human beings, is always either falling away into nothingness or else growing into the fullness of all God made us to become. These two dynamics, which direction are we choosing, are what the ancients meant by sin, which was just disintegrating into that nothingness, becoming nothing. From nothing you were made, from nothing you return. That's a choice you made. And perfection. God made you, God created you out of love in God's own loving image, which is love. You flower, you flourish, you become, you blossom into this fullness of love. So we're always going into we're kind of like we're either composting or blossoming. You could think of it that way. So it's not a shame-based dynamic. It's just, which direction do you want to go? And the people of faith in the ancient world were pointing toward this fullness. They believe that's what God created us for, this fullness of love, this perfection of love, this wholeness. So these terms, these original meaning, seems dangerously lost to us today. When people talk about sin and salvation today, especially with regard to gender identity and same-sex partnership, it doesn't seem like they're using it that way. So I've continually reviewed and reiterated what those things meant in their time. If we think about it, the way these things were understood by the people in the Bible and the people who first taught the gospel, it's going to take us it may take us in a direction that will allow us to flourish and blossom instead of dividing our communities, our faith communities, and falling apart. So the first kind of love, or movement of the heart, Augustine called it, or direction, is a flood tide that sweeps us down in love with restless cares, pouring our souls into the sand by loving what is perishable, fatally dissipating ourselves. So these are all different words he used for that sort of disintegrating direction. The other kind of love is a gift of spirit which bears us upward in a love for peace beyond all care, that our hearts may be lifted up to you. He's writing this as a prayer to God. so that once we cross over the troubled waters of ever-changing emotions about perishable things, we may reach all-surpassing rest. And again, it's like that same thing the mystics Meister Eckhart, Catherine of Siena described as melting into the ocean of bliss. And many Indian teachers have described it that way too. Either of these two kinds of love could be found and expressed in human love, in our sex acts, in our partnerships, regardless of gender. So if you have a straight marriage, it can be one that's all consumed by the restless cares of this world and focus on our perishable partner or our perishable self. It doesn't necessarily innately point us toward God just because we happen to be straight or not trans or something like that. Likewise, same-sex partners, trans partners, non-binary partners can be pointed in a direction that's greater than themselves by what they experience with each other. So, as Augustine goes on to conclude, the love of God and neighbor is a truth simple in itself, but in what a variety of mysterious ways is it given tangible expression. God is loved in what God has made, but God could not be loved if it were not through the Spirit that God has given us. Because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit bestowed upon us. Through God, we see that everything is good, which in any degree has being, because it derives from God, who has being in no degree at all, but simply is. I am. We are embodied incarnate beings, and our senses are the way we experience grace, the way God meets us where we are, connecting with us, expressing love in and through us. Any embodied experience can point us to worship, eating, dancing, singing, praying together, all those things we've explored in previous episodes and chapters. Recognizing the potential of human loving sexual intimacy to point us toward God, for example, celebrating marriage as sacramental, flows naturally and easily from biblical and historical traditions. But in some religious subcultures, purity culture has distorted, even denied, the role of the body and the senses to point us to worship and intimacy with God. If we truly believe that God made our bodies, wants us to love one another, wants our relationships to embody unconditional love, and that beauty and goodness point us to worship, then the perichoretic interpenetration of our human bodies and hearts can become for us a kind of communion. And perichoretic here, it refers to, it's not everybody's cup of tea, but in Christianity, there's this doctrine called the Trinity, where even God, perichoretic means dancing around, intermingled dancing. So kind of like dancing the hora together. God is relational in this particular way of describing God. So God is sort of dancing with God's self, creator God, ever being born child God, spirit God, lover, love, beloved, all dancing with each other. It's very much, this is what I'm saying here, when our bodies commingle like that, that can be an experience of communion for us. The Eucharistic elements and holy mystery of our expressions of human love sometimes draw us into and express a deep intimacy with the source of all love, so intimate and so sacred that we weep, we tremble, we give praise and thanks to the God who created, the one who created our beloved, ourselves, and the love between us. Human sacramental love, including its expression in sexual intimacy, can be a means of grace. Instead of policing the gender of the partners who express this grace in their love, or what kind of sex acts they share in their private moments of intimacy, why not focus on loving our Creator more fully in whatever we do and whomever we love? And here I close this subsection with a prayer from Augustine as well. Give me your love. Give me yourself, oh my God. Give yourself back to me. Lo, I love you. But if my love is too mean, too small, too narrow, let me love more passionately. I cannot gauge my love, nor know how far it fails, how much more love I need for my life to set its course straight into your arms, never swerving until hidden in the covert of your face. This alone I know, that without you, all to me is misery, woe outside myself and woe within, and all wealth but penury, if it is not my God. And here I'm going to transition with that prayer into a personal testimony. This is called a personal testimony, confessing God's grace. So, just as I just prayed with Augustine and with you, I believe God is love, helps us to love others, and that love is the image of God in which we are all created, and the only purpose for which we are redeemed. But I confess that I've struggled in my own life to experience and express human love and intimacy. After rereading Augustine's Confessions, his prayers remind me that my confessing to you, this section that I've just been struggling to write, it's not to draw attention to myself or my past failures, but only by sharing them to thank God for surviving them, to thank the community for surviving them, to thank those who taught me these things and who've practiced with me these different tools that I've been sharing, for surviving them and for being pointed in a different direction, for being loved anyway, and for any moments of being a channel of God's love that happen in spite of my obvious shortcomings. From the time I was a little child, I longed for one like myself, a best friend, one who intuitively knew and understood me as I would know and understand him. Growing up in the 1960s and the 1970s, in popular culture, the boys and men I saw as a child who loved each other like that, mostly TV shows, I'm thinking, and maybe some comic books. Those men who loved each other like that would pledge their loyalty to each other for the rest of their lives. And they would seal it with spit or with blood, usually pricking their finger or maybe cutting their wrist, not in a dangerous way. And then they would hold their flesh together, mingling their body fluids, their spit or their blood, to become what they would call blood brothers. One flesh, one blood, forever inseparable. From the time I was a small child and all through my young adulthood, I never longed to marry, certainly not as a woman, nor even when I assumed as a wishful young child that I'd grow up to be a man, never wanted to get married to a woman. Until I was a graduate student and John Boswell's work came out, I knew nothing of holy unions or same-sex marriage. That wasn't anywhere on my radar at all. Marriage as a model of partnership never captured my heart or imagination. It was a blood brother I wanted, the love between two men that not even death could separate. From the time I was a toddler, my heterosexual parents, whom I love very much, but they were challenged. They changed partners, they divorced, they remarried. They had some really rough times in those years when I was growing up. But what I thought as a child, and what I thought I saw was that blood brothers were forever. One blood, one flesh. Even if time and distance drew them apart, their blood and their vow could never be unmingled. Paradoxically, by the time I was coming of age during the first wave of the AIDS epidemic, fear of the blood of men who love each other is what drove the homophobic hatred that scared me into hiding myself in Christian womanhood, in celibacy, and even in failed attempts at heterosexual marriage. No matter how many decades I spent fasting, praying, ministering, studying, teaching, and complying with medical and psychiatric reparative interventions as a pastor and theology professor, wife, and mother, I struggled with a self hatred that was so deep that it often took all the energy I had not to end my life. I also was not able to bear others' expressions of love in word or in touch. I was just trying to perform a role, Christian womanhood, that I kept failing to live into no matter what angle or approach I took. Even in the intimacy of marriage, it wasn't me that my spouse was speaking to or touching. It was this character I'd been assigned to play that required, because I'm intersex, it required high doses of hormone therapies for me to feminize. It took lots of makeup, shaving, and pad. I didn't put shaving on here. There was an unbelievable amount of hair removal. Shaving and padding, or padding, to embody that role. And that came across as strained and false, no matter how hard I tried to live into it. Years of prayerful fasting and war against my own flesh led to chronic malnutrition by middle age and increasing health crises until something completely unexpected happened over which I had no control: a change in diagnosis and treatment for people like me. And this isn't a footnote, but for those who are curious, it's the diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association, changed in 2013. So, also in 2013, independent related to this, in one case, in 2013, independently of each other, my spiritual mentor and the doctors who treated my physical and mental symptoms of distress all agreed that forcing myself to change in order to live as a heterosexual woman wasn't working, even after 3 decades of concerted and intensifying efforts. It didn't appear it could. And that it seemed that the best course of action, as I was dying from the effects of these different psychological medications that were treating my anxiety and depression, all this, and the hormones, the best course of action seemed to try something new, because what we've been doing for 32 years in the case of the hormones and 35 years in the case of the psychological treatments was not working. My spiritual mentor, a straight woman herself, added that in my case, fighting with God to change me on my own terms, which was begging to be turned into a heterosexual woman, did not seem to be helping. She asked me if I'd ever tried thanking God for making me as I am, whatever that might be, even if it did mean maybe living as a man. We weren't sure about that at that time, but it looked like that might be something I was going to have to face. No, in all these years of prayer and theological study, I was a professional theologian. I was a professional pastor. In all those decades of prayer and theological study, I never even thought of trying such a thing, thanking God for making me complicated. What if I acted like God's grace was actually real, unconditional, and beyond my control, and thanked God in my awkward, embarrassing condition? What if I simply surrendered to what I could not understand or fix by myself, no matter how humiliating my condition seemed? Like the prodigal son in his father's hog pen, and just thanked God, who is compassionate and merciful. I started praying Psalm 139. I didn't even know how to pray a prayer like that. So I just opened the Bible to Psalm 131, looking for words that I could pray. So I confessed, while I prayed that psalm out loud, I confessed only that, like all other creatures, I too must be fearfully and wonderfully made, with intention, by a purposeful creator who loved me and whom I could trust. As I prayed, what came to me was a picture, an image of like a terrifying tidal wave looming over me as if it was going to destroy me. There was no doubt I could come through this alive, but I had no alternative left except to trust God to help me survive this oncoming, incomprehensible, potentially fatal onslaught, whatever it was going to be. After decades of trying, even with female hormones and countless combinations of therapies and psychiatric medications, I've learned I can't control my complicated body or its gender, nor whom my heart is drawn to love or how my body thrills to that love. I just happen to have an intersex condition, secondary sex characteristics that are different than my genetic and reproductive traits, and I love who I love. I didn't cause this, I can't control it, and I can't cure it. I don't have to understand who I am or why God made me this way. My experiences in and out of the closet, at the mercy of other people's changing diagnostic criteria, remind me of a poem I used to read with my students from the Letters and Papers Nazi resisting double agent theology professor, pastor, and martyr Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in a Nazi prison right before he was executed. It's called Who Am I? Bonhoeffer questions all the different ways other people see him from the way he sees himself, and the interchanges of his own wavering courage and cowardice, faith and doubt. He realizes he's an ever-changing person. He's mocked by some, heroicized by others. He knows that his own and other people's perceptions can't really capture the truth of what he is. I've been told in the same way that, well, not the same way, but it reminds me because I've been told by many that I'm a mentally ill, physically abnormal, heterosexual woman. Sorry. I've also been told by other people that I'm a sane, same gender loving trans man. And by still other people, later on, as time went by, that I'm simply a person with an intersex condition. And some people say because my biological sex is kind of non-binary or in between, I can't be part of a community of any particular sexual orientation, that I can't have any particular sexual orientation at all. So I can't base that answer to that question, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who am I? The same question that Augustine starts Confessions with. That's all of that whole book is about him saying, praying to God, who am I? And who do you say that I am? It's also a biblical question that Jesus asked. So, that's a question that's I've realized, in my life, I can't base my answer on what other people tell me because people don't seem to agree in my case. But I don't think God cares too much about these culturally defined gender roles and sexual orientation identities that we humans use to segregate ourselves from each other and define ourselves sometimes. God creates, loves, and sustains humans and our partnerships and our communities. So even if I don't fully understand why God made me a bit different than most people, and I certainly don't understand and can't control the terrifying, hateful reactions others have to my differences, or what has changed in my life because of their hatred, I do know that God has sustained me and uses me anyway. Because I live. I trust. I'm here. And like so many other people who are cast out as different by our communities of faith, God has borne more fruits of teaching, life-saving peer support, and friendship now that I'm no longer blocking this channel with self-hatred and fruitless efforts to change what God has made in God's wondrously creative, loving way. As Bonhoeffer concluded, whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. Another subsection to this last section is called fruit bearing isn't a gender issue. Jesus taught that his faithful followers are known by the fruit they bear, and that a bad tree that bears no fruit or bad fruit will be cut down and cast into the fire. Jesus himself withered a fruitless fig tree in leaf on the way to the temple just before he turned over a money changing table where people were financially exploiting others. Now, I just want to pause and say Jesus never physically harmed any person in spite of all the violence directed at him before and during the crucifixion, which we talked about when praying the Way of Sorrows a few episodes back, a few chapters ago. He only ever expressed anger against inanimate objects, and only in this story, the fig tree and then the tables. In this oldest gospel, Jesus' destruction of the fig tree just before casting the money changers out of the temple vividly illustrates that those who exploit the poorest worshipers and profit from religious legalism, the money changers and sellers of doves for sacrifice at the temple in this case, but I think it has modern applications, those folks are bad trees who bear no spiritual fruit. And remember, the spiritual fruits are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. So to cast them out, the money changers, or wither the fruitless fig tree, that might seem to disrupt the peace of the temple, but upsetting the religious status quo to agitate for justice is actually holy work. It's not violence. It's boundary setting. Sometimes very assertive boundary setting, but it's not violence. Sometimes bad, fruitless trees need to be cut down and cast out, according to Jesus, both by his example and his words, especially if they are choking out the fruit-bearing trees by exploiting those who are already oppressed. Bad fruit includes profiting by false legalistic interpretations of religious sacrifice requirements, whether it's selling doves and exchanging money in biblical times, or casting gender and sexual minorities out from the faith community into spiritual isolation, denying our marriages, ministries, families, and blocking these flowing channels of God's love. People who have strong opinions about any of this based in their religion and spirituality need to know that those of us whose gender or even biological sex is out of the ordinary are not unique, nor are we new. For at least the last 50 years, endocrinologists and other medical specialists have recognized that there are 6 or 7 markers inclusive of, and I'm talking about biological markers, inclusive of, but not limited to, external genitalia. 6 or 7 markers of gender, I should say. Or I'll say sex. How about that? All right. So external genitalia, sex organs, are one of those markers, but there are other ones, including neurological, the brain and nervous system, endocrinological, hormonal, in other words, chromosomal, genetic markers, and they can actually be different in some of us from the way our genitals look on the outside at the moment of our birth. And I seldom mention this, but I'm just going to mention it now. Let's just take a moment to remember that everybody's sex organs change from what they were like when they were born. Not, maybe there are some exceptions, but I mean, it's pretty much expected that when we go through puberty, there are some changes. For some of us, those changes are more unexpected than others, but everybody changes. At the same time, neuroscientists have also recognized that even the way our brains develop can be shaped by conscious choices regarding gender conformity, and that what gender role conformity is expected varies from culture to culture and even within a culture over time. Some describe the ways we choose to play out or adapt these culturally defined gender role expectations, gender performance. Cultures with a binary gender ideology, like some patriarchal religious cultures, for example, encourage us to perform either masculinity or femininity as our only 2 options. Not only that, but only specific kinds of masculinity or femininity are acceptable. The hegemonic or most widely endorsed form that best supports the socially constructed hierarchy and is presented across all aspects of a culture as the natural form of femininity or masculinity. In many religious communities right now, the forms of femininity and masculinity that are hegemonic, or these socially approved ones because they fit the hierarchy that the culture is based on, um, those forms of femininity and masculinity that in most of these patriarchal religious communities are heteronormative. That's part of the construction. In other words, they support the idea that only heterosexual relationships are natural and thus ideal. And so the ideally feminine woman naturally prefers to subordinate her own desires and tendencies to eat, to age, to have sex, to earn equal pay for the sake of having a harmonious relationship with men and children, while the ideally masculine man naturally prefers to dominate women, ridicule, and of course not have sex with effeminate men, and may sacrifice himself for others, but only in the most heroic, individualistic, triumphant, manly way possible. And I am not making all of this up. The source citations are in the footnote, and within each of those texts, there's much research explaining where they, documenting that gender is socially constructed and that particular gender ideals change over time and across cultures, and where we are now, there's some reasons for it. But all of these ideas about gender and sex are socially constructed. They vary across cultures and even within cultures over time, as I was saying, even within specific religious communities such as Christianity itself. And that's what I want to look at a little bit more. Christianity has not always been homophobic. That's not innate to Christianity. So when these differences are misunderstood as essential to being either male or female, as if those are the only two options innate to being human, then queerness of gender and performing gender in ways that transgress idealized masculinity or femininity, especially in contrast with the gender assigned at birth, tends to be interpreted as unnatural, immoral, or even sinful. And again, rather than going to that here, because that's all, I've done many lectures on that. There's sources cited here you can dig into more deeply to look at how gender and sex get to be the categories. No matter what your culture is and no matter how they're defined, those tend to be categories that can be used to control people. So I'm not going to talk about that more now. Those who hold Christian scriptures as their sacred text and special revelation directly from God need to be reminded that gender and sex essentialism, what I was just talking about, the idea that there's one kind of gender or sex that's innate to humanity, and that's the only kind that's natural or right. Gender and sex essentialism are not the good news of the gospel. Heterosexuality and gender conformity are not going to save us, nor are they what's left when the non-essentials of our spiritual lives have been burned away by the refiner's fire. There is no longer Jew or Greek, slave or free, male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's the message of what it looks like when we're living into the fullness of all that God created us to be. We're not drilling down on the narrowness of our differences. The censorship of all but heteronormative expressions of gender and sexual partnership is relatively new historically, and it's specific to Western medieval culture. An oddity first seen when early medieval rulers and Western church leaders mutually reinforced each other's power in what became medieval Christendom. Structures of wealth inequality, militarism, and patriarchal rule replaced the radical egalitarianism, communal sharing, and radical pacifism and universalism of the early centuries of world Christianity, whose birthplace had been not in Europe, but in the Middle East and North Africa. So if all of this that I'm saying to you seems unfamiliar and far-fetched, I'm going to invite you to look again at the most widely read, influential spiritual autobiography of the pre-medieval Christian tradition, Confessions. Twice in the early chapters of St. Augustine's spiritual autobiography. And again, I'm only citing this because this has had inordinate influence around the world through time among faithful Christians. They've read it and taken it to heart. Twice in the early chapters of his autobiography, Augustine recounts his deep love for another man in young adulthood. And he's a saint. He's still recognized as a saint in almost every tradition that recognizes saints. I would say, yeah, there are some Christian traditions that don't recognize saints, right? Like, so if you don't recognize saints at all, then he's not a saint to you. But if in all the Christian traditions that do recognize saints, he's one of them. And he is unapologetic and, in fact, joyful about the love that he had for a male partner. There's nothing actually surprising about this. In both Greek and Roman cultures during biblical times and in these earliest centuries of Christianity, the sexual partnership between an adult male and a young man, the beloved eromenos, was highly prized as central to male socialization. Augustine's first experience of loving and being loved, so sweet to him, was love between men. In this long dialogue with God, Augustine confesses that intellectual discourse and theatrical outings with his lover, bound as they were by the heavenly serenity of compassionate friendship, sometimes boiled over into what he calls lust and impurity. Looking back on these experiences after, and he's writing this toward the end of his life, in midlife, and then he wraps it up decades later at the end of his life. He's looking back on these experiences after having taken a vow of celibacy as a monk. Okay, so and at that point, looking back on it from his monastic life, he laments that divine law, now this is a quote, begin quote, divine law did not make men to have that kind of relationship with each other. The very fellowship which ought to hold between ourselves and God is violated when our nature is defiled by perverted lust, since our nature is his creation, end quote. Okay. So I'm entering a new subsection called What About Sodom and Gomorrah? So I'm not, what I just quoted to you, if you haven't ever read this, he lamented that divine law didn't make men to have that kind of relationship with each other. Okay, and he does have lament about falling short of his love for God by getting so wrapped up in human love. I'm going to clarify for you, even he himself is not lamenting the fact that they're same-sex partners. So just hold up and it's going to make sense. So what about Sodom and Gomorrah? All right. For those who've been taught that the Bible prohibits all same-sex love is sinful, we may need to slow down and look at Sodom and Gomorrah, mentioned here by Augustine. It's right after the quote that I just shared with you, and perhaps springing to mind for some raised with the Bible as their guide. You might already be on like, whoa, sodomy. In Western Christian culture, laws against same-sex physical intimacy, even in cultures, I'm talking about now, okay, even in cultures that claim to have separation of church and state, are still often called sodomy laws. And they take their name from this biblical story that so many misinterpret as condemning male homosexuality. So even if you're not a Christian, it's kind of important to slow down and look at what the heck is this sin of the sodomites. Okay, the ancient biblical understanding of the sin of the sodomites and how it defiles human relationships is not homoerotic. Augustine himself, even in this very passage about his same-sex love affairs, decries the wealth hoarding viciousness of nations, not individual sex acts. So what he was upset about was we were so obsessed with our theatrical outings and our love of books, and we were distracted from loving God together. All right. So anyway, and what Augustine laments, the wealth hoarding viciousness of nations, is what the biblical prophets lament as well. The Bible introduces Sodom as a well-watered plain of the Jordan, a land so rich in foods and other goods that it was raided by neighboring peoples. So it was a land where people came and stole the resources from the native people. And that was a sin. Abraham argues with God over the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah without specifying what their sin is. That's that whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah. First time we ever hear it in Genesis. And that's the passage people love to point to and say, oh, look, that God hates gays. No, they never specify what the sin is when Abraham's arguing to save Sodom and Gomorrah. But God later explains to Moses, the next time Sodom and Gomorrah comes up, that God destroyed these cities specifically because, I'm going to give you all the quotes, because their residents had grown fat, filled with food, heavy and sleek on God's abundant blessings, and lacked discernment, worshiping foreign gods, idols, and false gods. I don't know if you heard anything about same-sex marriage in there, but I sure didn't. The Bible laments Sodom's sins as greed and gluttony, especially the sin of ignoring poverty and neglecting malnourished, dehydrated infants. The Hebrew prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and the Christian apostle Paul all condemn the Sodomites as shamelessly, openly arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy, the fatherless, nor the widow. Only the tiny, very late Christian letter of Jude describes these towns as sexually immoral and perverse. And the word here in Greek is ekporne. I'm sorry, my eyes are kind of screwed up here. Ekporne. I'm sorry. I have lost. I've got it written in Greek here, and it's been a long time since I studied Greek. Plus, my eyes are not the world's greatest. The point here is the root word of this word in Jude that appears once is porneia. Porneia. So I mean, we all know the word porn. All right. So it's the same root word. It's a vague word in this language, in the original biblical Greek, that denotes any form of sexual immorality or impurity. It's generally any expression of sexuality outside of marriage covenant. In Anselm's work too, 1,000 years later, I've been talking about Augustine, I'm talking about Anselm for a minute. There too, Anselm picks that thread up, talks about fornication having two senses: loss of virginity and any tendency of the soul to fall away from the love of Christ. And it's that latter sense that Augustine is focused on, thus being estranged spiritually from God. So it's when we're choosing the lesser things, the things that are in the material world that are going to perish. They can't be relied on in the same way as eternal things. It's not that they're bad. It's only when we love those more than God, or when we love those so much that here's where the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism actually helped me a lot to understand what the ancient Christians meant by, and medieval Christians meant by this. But that sense that if I'm so attached to the things of the world that I'm treating them as if they're never going to change, then I'm creating my own suffering. And the ups and downs that naturally happen, that's what my hand motions are. Ups and downs of life, the bumps in the road. I'm going to get really snagged by those. I'm going to be suffering because I was expecting things to never change. I was, as Augustine ultimately laments about the love of his life, the man that he loved, he was grief-stricken because he loved this man as if he was never going to die. And the young man died in young adulthood. So Augustine had this lifetime of suffering until he could come to a point where he could accept that and let that love point him to a love of God. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm going to go on about it a little bit more without belaboring it, I hope. Anyway, this verse in Jude is the only time the Bible mentions this aspect of their sin. It's Jude 1:7. That's the only time sexuality ever comes up in the whole Bible connected to Sodom and Gomorrah. So even here, The immorality is connected not to same-sex loving partnership, but rather to ungodliness, self-pollution, rejection of God-ordained authority, and abuse of celestial beings. That's in Jude 1:8. So, a lot of people point out, and it seems self-evident if you look at the first place that story of Sodom and Gomorrah with Abraham. Basically, the guys rape these celestial beings. It's the rape, the violence that has nothing to do with same-sex marriage. St. Augustine condemns these sins of the Sodomites, the ones we've just talked about, greed, indifference, violence, in this passage. As St. Augustine condemns these as neglect of God and those in needs for pursuit of selfish pleasures. But he praises the man he loved, and he praises the love they shared in this same confessional prayer, a love that he describes as equal to or even more significant than the better known heterosexual relationship that produced his only son, his only child. All right. Oh boy, we're already in an hour. I have way more to share with you. I'm just better. Yeah, I'm going to keep going. Let's see. So, examples of the fruit bearing faith of same sex lovers besides Augustine. So, Augustine describes this same sex love of his life as bound fast together with him, the two of them cleaving together through the gracious love that only the Holy Spirit pours into hearts. He celebrates their love as a gift of God. Here's what he says: "My soul could not bear to be without him. His friendship was sweeter to me than any sweetness I'd known in my whole life." As his friend lay dying as a young adult, Augustine recounts, "I did not leave him. So closely were we dependent on each other." The death of his beloved plunged Augustine into such deep grief that he says, "Everything I had shared with my friend turned into hideous anguish without him. My eyes sought him everywhere, but he was missing. I hated all things because they held him not. The man my soul held more dear and lost was more real and more lovable than the fantasy of God in which it was bidden to trust." Augustine confesses, "I had been like another self to him. I felt that my soul and his had been but one soul in two bodies. Everything that was not what he was seemed to me offensive and hateful." To describe their love, Augustine invokes the then well-known story of the same-sex lovers Orestes and Pylades to illustrate how significant and deep this love he had was. And again, I can't stress this enough. We may not know who Orestes and Pylades are now. At the time, people would have known that reference like they would know Romeo and Juliet now. That was just a common, widely known example of love that everybody knew in popular culture. For either of them, Orestes and Pylades, to live without the other would have been worse than death, their story goes. As the story of Orestes and Pylades goes, take God as witness of the passion between them, Orestes and Pylades sailed through life together as though in one boat. Attacked by barbarians, in quotes, I'm quoting Lucian on this, the ancient text that writes down this very well-known myth or oral tradition of the ancient world. So attacked by barbarians during their travels, the sickly Orestes fell down and lay on the ground, seized, as the story goes, seized by his usual mania, while Pylades wiped away the foam, tended his body, and covered him with his well-woven cloak, acting not, as the story goes, acting not only like a lover, but like a father. When their captors condemned one of them to death, allowing that the other could live as a message bearer for them, Orestes volunteered to be put to death, and the story goes, he refused to take the letter, saying that Pylades was more worthy to carry it, acting more like the lover than the beloved. Such love, I'm continuing the story as it's written, the ancient story as it's written says, such love is always like that. For when from boyhood a serious love has grown up and it becomes adult at the age of reason, the long-loved object returns reciprocal affection, and it is hard to determine which is the lover of which. For, as from a mirror, the affection of the lover is reflected from the beloved. That's a quote from the ancient story, love between two men. Though Augustine confesses to God his love for this man is wrong, it's not because of their gender. He lifts up Orestes and Pylades as an example of what love between people should be. He doesn't condemn homosexuality. Rather, just as he later regrets the inordinate love he had for the mother of his son, he confesses to God, pouring out his, quote, soul into the sand by loving a man doomed to death as though he were never to die, end quote. In other words, he only laments loving any human being so much that he was distracted from the underlying source of that love, the one who creates us all. Centuries after Augustine, Christian same-sex partners still experienced their love as sacramental, and the Christian church blessed those unions. For example, early Christian saints Simeon the Holy Fool, or Simeon Salus of Emesa, and John of Edessa, and this is about in the 500s, in the 6th century, they were close childhood friends whose special partnership was blessed by their presiding abbot when they both took their monastic vows together. So in other words, they took monastic vows, and on the same day and the same ceremony, the abbot blessed their partnership, not just their individual monastic vows. This early brother making, or adelphopoie ceremony, I'm sorry if I don't say that right, this brother making ceremony was a kind of same-sex union. Simeon and John were referred to as, in Christian calendars, they shared the same saint day. They were referred to as the pure bridegrooms, or nymphoi, the same word as nymph, same root word, nymphoi of Christ. And they lived as desert hermits 29 years together. So when Simeon felt called to leave after 29 years of living together with his partner for the urban mission of his Holy Fool ministry, John begged him, quoting John here, for the sake of him who joined us, do not wish to be parted from your brother. You know that after God, I have no one except you, my brother, but I renounced all and was bound to you. Remember that fearful hour when we were clothed in the holy habit, and we too were as one soul, so that all were astonished at our love. End quote. For over 1,000 years, Simeon and John were always honored in Christian calendars together as inseparable partners on the same saint day. And long before these examples from early Christian history, Jesus himself blessed a same-sex couple, healing the younger male lover of a Roman centurion who asked him. The young man gets well on Jesus' command. Jesus even celebrated the faith of this same gender-loving man as greater than that of his Jewish peers. In the original Greek of the Gospel of Matthew, the oldest version of this story in the Bible, the word that's used twice by the lovesick, worried, faithful centurion, and also by the gospel writer to describe the one who is sick and suffering at home is peis. In all of the Greek literature of this time, referring to the receptive partner in a union between two men. And finally, the conclusion, this last subsection is called Our Love Embellishes the World. A recent conversation with a well-meaning colleague in community service reminded me that evangelical Christians may have absorbed some confusing stereotypes about some sort of monolithic gay culture with nightclubs, parties, casual sex with multiple partners. And when I say evangelical Christian, I also mean those of us who are LGBT or gender and sex minorities who have been raised within the church and have internalized these stereotypes. We may even ourselves think, oh, I must not be gay because I'm not necessarily drawn to a party culture or a life with multiple partners. So there's a stereotype out there. Perhaps folks who've only know this stereotype may not realize that gay people and gender minorities are as diverse in that way as any other people. People who want a faithful relationship with each other and connection with a faith community may be gay or trans, or they may be straight or not trans. They may be trans, intersex, non binary, or have a very conventional experience of gender. When I was a college professor working with young adult students who lived on campus, so the height of people's sex drive and experimentation sometimes with substances and behaviors. Um, Even on a religious campus, students were more likely to have a casual attitude to sex outside marriage with opposite sex partners. In other words, the cisgender, endosex, heterosexual students, the straight people, were much more likely to party and enjoy hookup culture without major consequences than the students who were struggling with their issues of gender identity and sexual orientations. I didn't mean to say orientations, I meant. So the students who were struggling with how to be people of faith and they were struggling with issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. Um, Even my evangelical colleague that I was just talking about this topic with the other day agreed that the LGBTQI people of faith we know tend far more often to live a self-sacrificial life of celibacy or to have sexless partnerships or to have long-lasting faithful marriages than their straight counterparts. Um, I'm going to say typically gendered as well, because we were really talking, well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, my point really here is gay or straight, a life of celibacy, a life of faithful covenant, or more open and casual sexuality are more likely matters of individual preference, a matter of how an individual is called and equipped by a power greater than ourselves to live. These are not automatically and innate to any particular sexual orientation or gender identity. When we love someone we respect, someone whose spiritual gifts we see serving and nurturing others, this love can inspire and empower us to want to be a better person ourselves. And in that, I'm speaking from experience. It may not be a love I've acted on in terms of intimacy or physical intimacy, but I have been inspired by loving men I respect and care about. Inspired to grow, serve more, have healthier boundaries. Um, the channel's been opened wider by loving someone. A love like this is a treasured gift in the life of anyone who experiences it, regardless of the gender of the beloved or the lover. It might be easier for those of us cast out of our faith communities and denied access to earning a living and other basic life needs to fear or fight the misguided human beings who try to shame us for this gift of love. But instead, what I've observed is that we persist, forming our partnerships, building and serving our communities, gathering where love is. No matter what our gender or that of our beloved, such love turns us in the direction of our Creator, giving thanks and praise for them, our community, our partners, and for this love to the source of all that is beautiful and good. As in the biblical Song of Songs, which says, "What is your beloved more than another beloved? My beloved is radiant, distinguished among 10,000. His speech is most sweet, and his altogether desirable. This is my beloved, and this is my friend. How fair and pleasant you are, O loved one, delectable." Like the writer of Songs, I thank God with my whole being for the times love has sustained and transformed me. Song of Songs also says, I was a wall. Then I was, in his eyes, as one who brings peace. Closeted, hiding, and ashamed, I also was a wall. My stone heart was shut against myself and other people I thought I couldn't trust to love me as my hidden, complicated gender minority self. But in tender intimacy, we transcend that experience of being a monstrous abomination to other people. Love humanizes us. When I've loved someone, the tender, respectful regard and words of my beloved and our shared labor for the good of our community have reflected back to me that image of God in which even I am made, that deeply hidden self I always thought invisible and unnamed to everyone but God. Once I was a wall. In his eyes, I was as one who brings peace. And so I saw myself at last, and so I knew I was seen. Loving has restored me to being human, at peace with myself so that I can live at peace with others. Encouraged, supported, and inspired by moments of a love greater than myself, human and divine, even I, can finally be a channel of God's peace. Some joke that homosexual partnership can never be God's will because God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. But that biblical story of human partnership itself just suggests that our partnerships weren't created just to reinforce gender conformity or heteronormativity, but rather to help us live in committed, blessed intimacy and serve all of creation and God in a mutually supportive and fruitful way. The Bible says now that Hebrew, this is originally in Hebrew, and it's called Bereshis. We translate it as Genesis. The Orthodox Jewish Bible translation of this verse is, and Hashem Elohim, which is a plural name for God in the Bible. They, them pronouns for God. God uses we, us pronouns in the Bible in the earliest parts. And Hashem Elohim said, it is not tov, good, that the Adam, which just means it's not a proper name, it's not a male name, it just means the human being made of earth, should be alone. I will make him an Hezer, a helper, suitable for him. This biblical account is God's concern for human need for companionship. It expresses the unity, the one fleshness of this relationship between two sexual partners committed to each other. This first human being, Ha-Adam, seems to have been both male and female until divided toward the end of the second chapter. And God says that this original person is good. What God says is not good is that for that human to be alone. God's solution is to create an equivalent partner, making two people out of that one original being's flesh. After creating this partnership, God declares humankind complete and good. The first person immediately recognizes this total stranger as his partner and greets her as bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, one flesh. He names her the one taken out of himself, the word that we translate as woman. But is it their differences that make them partners, maleness and femaleness of gender, in contrast with that original intersex androgyny that God made and declared good? Or is it this oneness between them, their sameness of flesh, that makes them fitting partners. He couldn't be a partner in the same way with all the other creatures that were made before. It's after he gives all the other creatures names that God's looking and God's saying, wait a minute, that's not gonna, he likes them, but it's not quite enough. It's the sameness. He needed a human partner. God's own focus in this creation story is on their not being alone, on their likeness to each other, and on one being a help to the other. The Hebrew word hezer, and the longer phrase for this new partner, hezer kenegdo, that's often translated helpmeet, are not gendered terms. They're not about female submission. Oh, no. Hezer just means helper and is used to describe God throughout the Psalms, almost never used to describe a human being. Hezer is a sign of strength and power, spiritual and creative support from one partner in the life of another, in the same way that God illuminates, inspires, and strengthens human beings. Kenegdo is a Hebrew preposition, an adverb that often goes with hezer here, hezer kenegdo, in this Genesis story of partnership. It means corresponding to or face to face. So it's best understood as meaning that the partner created from the same flesh as Ha-Adam was a fitting partner face to face with that original human, one like that first person, an equal. When Hezer is used for God throughout the Psalms, it connects our awareness of the ways God is our helper to our reverence for God as our creator, sustainer, and deliverer, God's power. So it reminds us that God comes alongside and with us, as well as being the one who is so much more than us. And that's what the Bible's telling us human partnership is created to be when it uses this word. To fulfill the deepest meaning our human sexual partnerships can have, we can offer each other the same kind of faithful, mutually empowering, and inspiring love that God gives unconditionally to us. That is not a gender issue. And what of those who argue that God's command to be fruitful and multiply requires binary maleness, femaleness, and heterosexuality? Even Augustine points out at length in his prayerful reflection on the creation story, as a celibate person whose only child has died in youth, that there are many ways to be fruitful. For Augustine, affirming the fruitfulness of those who live monastic, chaste lives, childless lives, is deeply important. Like Jesus' own teachings on good trees bearing good fruit and Paul's on the fruits of the Spirit, Augustine values fruits of our service to other people and our devotion to God, our growth into the fullness of the people God has created us to be, rather than falling away into fruitless self-destruction. The love between same-sex partners points us to the source of all love, the many forms of beauty and goodness that our love brings into the world: artistic expression, community care, supporting our extended and chosen families, makes the world more beautiful, pointing to the source of all beauty and goodness, the one who is infinite love and beauty. Queer covenant relationships are sacramental when those who enter them live their love as blessed by God for the sake of blessing others. Queer love proclaims Adelphos, my sibling, bone of my bones, flesh of my queer flesh, two bodies, one heart. My pais, my eromenos, my sweetheart and partner. We receive each other's love as nourishing bread. Beloved breadmate and companion, our loving nourishes and creatively upbuilds us, sustains, helps, and delivers us. Each other's Hezer Kenegdo. Our love embellishes the world.